Well, good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Rachel Feltman. My name is Jamie and I'll be your host for the evening. So just a couple of things before we get started tonight. Go ahead and pop open your chat box. I will be using this to provide discount codes, links to view tonight's title, the author's website, and all the good stuff you'll need. And for any questions or comments for tonight's author, go ahead and submit them under the Q&A icon, which is right at the bottom right of your screen. So now I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's author. Rachel Feltman is the executive editor of Popular Science and hosts Popsci's podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week. In 2014, she founded the Washington Post's Speaking of Science blog, known for headlines like "You probably have herpes, but that's really okay." Rachel studied environmental science at Simon's Rock and has a master's in science reporting from NYU. She's a musician and actress and the stepmom of a very spry 14-year-old cat. Now she's with us tonight to discuss her debut myth-busting history of sex, Been There, Done That. First off, congratulations on your debut, Rachel.
Thank you so much.
I so enjoyed reading this book and was hoping you could start us off with a brief reading so everyone can get a sense of the clever wit they can expect.
Sure, I would love to. I am going to just do a quick reading from my chapter on birth control. Should have bookmarked this, but I will get it in just a second. So this is chapter 8. The title of the chapter is "Have We Always Used Birth Control?" And the subtitle is "In which crocodile dung goes into some unspeakable places, Casanova loses all of your respect, and people sneeze semen everywhere." Contrary to what periodic peaks of moral outrage might have you believe, baby making has always been pretty low on our sexual to-do list. Don't believe me? Just ask the women from some 4,000 years ago who spent their days shoving crocodile dung up their vaginas. As discussed in our chapter on reproduction, humans were blissfully unaware of the exact mechanics of human fertilization until the late 1800s, and didn't even spot sperm for the first time until 1677. But long before we'd begun to investigate the little swimmers that help us wriggle our way into existence, people got wise, relatively speaking anyway, to the fact that when two become one, they could then become three. We don't have any way of knowing when and how this became common knowledge. That's because the idea that sex and babies are linked is probably older than our own species. A hominid wouldn't need that much cognitive prowess to put two and two together. And communities were probably more successful when they told their kids that flagrant boning might leave them with another mouth to feed. In fact, it's likely that the first widely practiced method of birth control was simply breastfeeding, in a brilliant evolutionary bid to make sure mamas have enough resources to rear their young to maturity. Regular nursing triggers hormones about as effective as modern contraceptive pills, at least for the first 6 months. But for people who weren't interested in having even one kid or nursing them until they went off to college, the first evidence of effective birth control crops up in texts from ancient Egypt. Sometime between the realization that sex made babies and the earliest days of recorded history, folks decided semen was the thing to avoid. This was smart. If ejaculate can't make its way into the cervix, pregnancy can't happen. So Egyptian women in 1850 BC combined bits of honey, salts, and sometimes crocodile dung to create spermicidal plugs. The acidity of the poop and other ingredients, combined with the stickiness of the honey and the physical barrier of the plug itself, would have been fairly effective at blocking and killing sperm. Meanwhile, although we're not sure they knew it at the time, the powerful antimicrobial properties of honey would have helped keep the gooey suppository from causing a dangerous infection. By the 1500s BC, ground up acacia leaves, which we now know produce lactic acid, which inhibits sperm motility, were a crucial component. Archaeologists have even found recipes for abortifacient concoctions inside ancient tombs, perhaps indicating that Egyptians counted on having a pretty freaky afterlife and didn't want any undead kids to put a damper on it. You may not quite buy that early humans knew how to harness breastfeeding as a contraceptive. Even so, with the records of these theoretically effective Egyptian contraceptives, that makes almost 4,000 years of documented attempts to do the crime without doing the time. And we haven't stopped since. In 1997, psychologist Craig Hill set out to determine the most common motivating factors behind human sexual intercourse. He presented 8 typical motivations. Getting pregnant got ranked dead last.
It's just so well written. I just
Thank you.
loved it. Thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Yeah, so let's just jump in. What was your inspiration for writing this book? Why write about sex?
Well, I have always loved learning about science and health and talking people's ears off about everything I've learned, which is why I became a science journalist and then editor. And sex has always been one of my favorite topics in that regard. My mother used to be an OB/GYN, so I grew up really hearing about the biological aspects of sex and reproduction from as early as I can remember. But I also had a very complicated relationship with sex. I grew up in the evangelical church and in a very rural, relatively conservative area. So I got a lot of mixed signals. And by the time I grew up and became a science journalist, I really thought I had my head on straight when it came to sex and the body. And there was still just so much, there were so many deep-seated misconceptions that I still held. And I became really interested in, as a science journalist, sharing stories that were really relatable and really humanized science. And I found that sex was one of the best topics for that. It makes people a little nervous, a little giggly, and that's a great way to trick them into learning something. And then the flip side of that is that most people don't know nearly as much about sex as they think they do. I did a lot of reporting on sexually transmitted infections, which have hit record highs many years in a row in the US. And I had a lot of really profound moments of realization reading the research that's out there on STIs, coming to understand that stigma and fear and taboos around talking about sexual health were much more of a problem than promiscuity. And that just really got me started thinking about how my love of weird history and trying to make science and the past accessible to people might help sort of crack open the way we talk about sex. And it went from sexual health to being about sex as a whole, because sex is so intertwined with our species and our culture, with life and the planet. So it really wasn't enough to just talk about sexual health. That meant talking about birth control and erectile dysfunction and gender and 385 million year old fossilized fish. And now, several years later, here we are.
That is such a wonderfully compelling reason. Kind of along those lines, what place does humor have in addressing STIs, trans acceptance, and abortion access, matters that can really be life or death?
Yeah, so, setting out to write a funny book about the whole history of sex, at times felt really foolish or daunting, because there are so many ways in which the intersection of our lives and the way we have sex, or the way we talk about biological sex and gender, are really life or death issues for so many people. And I think what it came down to is that the humor in this book is not, it's not about tricking people who don't respect those issues into paying attention to them. It's about offering a welcoming and heartening space for people who are maybe dealing with those issues themselves, or who are just starting to think about how sex and gender and reproduction might fit into their lives. So it is a funny book, but it is funny, silly, not not stand-up funny, because there are a lot of serious issues to cover.
And what I kind of found while I was reading is that all of the humor, it's not judgmental in nature. You're just giving us a lot of information and really just making jokes about it that isn't judgmental, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, I tried to be really, really compassionate. I really tried, I think the edits I was most careful with were in making sure that even when I was trying to be funny, I was speaking with the same compassion that I would want a younger version of me, or a younger sibling, or a child to be reading.
That really came through.
Thank you.
So now let's talk about research, which this must have required a ton of. Can you tell us a little bit about your process and what kind of sources you used, and just give us the deep dive on how you did your history?
Yeah. So as I state many times in the book, I am not a historian, let alone one focused on the history of sex. I am very good at collecting lots of random bits of information, and I did that pretty chaotically, unfortunately, because it was my first book. I learned a lot of lessons from my second book. But one of my favorite ways of sourcing information, which is something I often do for my podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, is starting with those really terribly sourced, but really fun, like listicles of like the most shocking XYZ in history. You'll never believe what ancient Romans did in the bedroom. And 9 times out of 10, those facts are not going to be correct. Obviously, there's a reason those listicles are so fun. It's because they often are just made up. You can make things really shocking when you just make things up. But I have found that when you find that one that is actually based in truth, and then you kind of, I work on just tracing the sourcing back to an actually good baseline source. And usually it takes a few degrees of hopping back. Yeah. And that 1 out of 10 facts on those lists, when you get to the actual sourcing, it's almost always even wilder and more interesting than that listicle made it sound. And then the flip side of that is that you can also, I often find things to kind of debunk that way. I am not the first person to debunk this, but one story that comes up over and over again, including on like very popular, like weird history TikTok accounts and that kind of genre, is this story about Cleopatra using a gourd full of bees as a vibrator, which is just like, you don't have to think that hard about that to realize that it's very unlikely to be true. Just logistically really baffling. Doesn't even seem like it would be like a very good vibrator, honestly. A lot of trouble for yeah. So that came from a very popular nonfiction book in 1992, and that book gets cited over and over again. A lot of people don't realize that most nonfiction books are not fact-checked. Mine was, thank goodness. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. And most authors these days do choose to have their books fact-checked. But in 1992, I don't think anyone was doing that. So there is this issue where people will be like, oh, it's in a book, so it's not on Wikipedia, I can trust it. And really, it's kind of the opposite is true. So I love going through little internet rabbit holes, trying to find the like primary literature that like some historian put hours and hours of work to that then years later became very misconstrued in some like ranker.com article. And then also just a lot of reading academic papers, just casting a really wide net and sort of pulling together threads of things that themes that keep coming up, or stories from history that I want to dig deeper into. I read a lot of books, including a lot of books about kind of the idea of sex and gender that were like very heavy, really deeply thoughtful and philosophical books that I think most people are not ever going to read because they are very thorough and deeply philosophical. So hopefully, you know, my book full of dick jokes will get a little sliver of some of those really brilliant thoughts in front of people. And I did get to do a little bit of research in person at the New York Academy of Medicine, which is awesome. They will let you just make an appointment and they'll pull books for you. And I definitely handled books that I did not think I should be allowed to touch, but apparently the books they have that are like poetry about syphilis from the 1600s are not, they're like closely guarded medical texts. So they just let me at them. So yeah, a lot of research went into this book. And like I said, thank goodness for fact checkers, because by the time I finished, I probably had several hundred PDFs to sort through.
Wow, that's amazing. Your poor editor having whoever had to fact check that. Along those lines, what surprised you the most that you learned, or maybe what historical fact shocked you the most?
Yeah, well, I'm glad we did the birth control reading, because that crocodile dung fact is very obviously shocking. You know, just because it's crocodile poop being used as a contraceptive is just inherently shocking. But the fact that it probably worked, no one's actually tested this in a clinical setting for obvious reasons, and please don't try it at home. There are much better options, even in the natural world, I promise. But you know, that combo of something that changes the vaginal pH along with a cervical barrier is like a classic combo. We see it again and again throughout history. The Talmud talks about sponges soaked in vinegar. There's the classic story that's often attributed to Casanova, though he should not get credit for it, where you use like half a lemon, and that kind of like citrus rind idea does come up again and again. And it's because like that works. And actually today there's one of the newest FDA approved birth controls is a gel called Phexxi, which is there are these very like girl bossy Instagram ads about
Good
how
commercials.
where it's like, you don't need hormones, you can have on-demand natural hormone-free birth control. And it's you know, a gel that changes the pH to you know, inhibit sperm motility. And I just think it's so funny that that is essentially what Egyptian women were doing 4,000 years ago. We just now have an FDA tested version with no crocodile poop. So things have improved, but also it's pretty incredible that they were, you know, putting together methods that reasonably would have been pretty effective back then.
It's absolutely incredible. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, we spoke a little before about, there's a portion in there to all of you watching about the women's orgasm, and it goes in the opinions and how men thought about it and how people thought it affected actual fertility. And it was just so interesting and shocking. I love that that was included. So for people reading this like me, what do you want us to take from it?
I think the biggest takeaway in my mind is that we are told a lot, both explicitly and implicitly, about what kind of sex is normal and what kind of sex isn't, how we should feel about our bodies and about relationships and having children, about our sexuality, about what we like in bed or don't like, about whether we like sex at all. And it's really based on just very arbitrary cultural norms of the day. You know, if you look around the world and throughout history, which this book obviously just has a small sliver of, there is so much more I could have talked about. It's very clear that things get regressed and they progress again, and cultures will become obsessed with this one specific thing or making this other specific thing really taboo. And just the more you look, the more clear it is that what is considered normal versus abnormal for us today is not based on any like innate human nature or some like innate truth about what's good for us or what's bad for us. And then meanwhile, we, sorry, I don't know if you can hear those sirens. Okay. So, and then meanwhile, culturally, it's quite normalized for us to accept a lot of very heteronormative, often very like violent sexual dynamics, and accept all these ways that sex or dating or marriage will make us feel bad about ourselves and make our lives worse. And what I hope people take away from this book is that really all you should care about is not hurting other living creatures, and everything else is like really okay. And if someone tells you it isn't, you should think about why they're telling you that. Because I promise the answer isn't because that thing is inherently bad. And yeah, I think also just like, it's not just sex, like being humans is about being very weird. We're a very weird species. And I think anytime anyone tries to like tell you what is like normal human behavior versus not normal human behavior, you should be a little skeptical.
Yeah, I love that point that you make in the book. For whatever kink or whatever you're into, trust me, there's been so much weirder in history that, you know, I really appreciated your book. I wanted to ask you, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, the cover is absolutely beautiful. What's the story behind the cover? How'd you come up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I did come up with it. Authors generally don't get much say in their covers, and I got very lucky. Pete Gerso, who did the cover, is I had never heard of him because cover design is not something I think about a lot in my day-to-day life. And then once I looked him up, I was like, no wonder this cover's so good. All the best book covers in the last few years have been by him. So yeah, I had some conversations with my editor and agent and publisher about sort of what we saw, what we imagined for the book. And I did say pretty clearly I wanted it to be like a historical illustration. I just love the kind of like, I was very much raised on Monty Python, so I love the I love silly pictures of historical naked people. And I also wanted it to be, I wanted it to be fun and not like too trying to be sexy. Like some of the ideas that got floated very early as just kind of brainstorming were like a close up of a pair of lips or like a, you know, a sweaty body. And I was like, it's not, you know, there's nothing wrong with erotica. I read a lot of erotica, but this isn't erotica. It's a silly history book. And we wanted people to immediately be able to tell that this was going to be about history and that it was going to be fun. and inviting. So I had like no notes on this cover. As soon as I saw it, I was like, this is this is amazing. So yes, I was very fortunate. And I love that they have little socks on. It's just great.
And the belt, it's really cute. I'm wondering if we can switch gears just a little bit. And this is your debut. Can you elaborate a little bit on your writing process? Were there any challenging revisions that you had to make during the process?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I spent 2 years on the proposal off and on, because I was working full time at Popsci. And it was my first book. And I had a very, in retrospect, a very vague idea when I started out. So it was good. And my agent, Jeff Shreve at the Science Factory, is incredible. And there were many times when if he was less incredible, this book would have just not happened. So lots of research, lots of revision in the proposal stage, so that by the time that I actually sold it, I had done not all of the research, but I would say like close to half of the research I was going to do for the book, which ended up being very good because I committed to writing the book in March of 2020. Wow. So writing it was pretty difficult because I think most things were pretty difficult for most people. I was very fortunate to have my job and keep my job, and have a very supportive, now spouse. I also planned a wedding during the pandemic.
Wow.
I don't recommend that to anybody. That was not the way the timeline was supposed to go, but that was just how life happened. But yeah, so that certainly complicated things. And, I have, again, my agent and my editor, Ben Platt, and several, friends in the journalism and writing community. I really, it seems like everybody who's writing a book over the last few years had a pretty tough time. But also I'm an editor. I started out as a reporter, but I've been mostly editing for about 5.5 years now. And honestly, the hardest part of writing the book was just forcing myself to write it. I spent a lot of time asking when it would be a book, like when it would start to feel like I actually knew how to write a chapter of a book. And once I was convinced by my long-suffering agent and editor to just get the text out, it was really fun. And honestly, I am much harder on myself as an editor than my editor was on me. So in that way, the actual revision process was a lot smoother than the process of convincing myself to sit down and write. But yeah, as a first-time book writer, the whole process was fascinating. I mean, the recording the audiobook was super fun.
You did it?
I did, yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Which they only let me do because I have a podcast. So they were like, people for some reason enjoy listening to your voice. So maybe some of them will buy the audiobook if you read it. And I think the key was that I went in extremely humble, assuming that none of my podcast skills would transfer over to audiobook narration skills. And luckily I was wrong, but I think if I had gone in overly confident, it could have been a really painful process. So yeah, I feel I had a really supportive team, but it's a lot of work. Try to book.
And especially one so dense in research, it's congratulations. It's years.
Thank you so much.
And to all of you listening, we have some time for questions, but we do have one from Tyler, who was my next question. Tyler, Is there anything you're working on now that we can be on the lookout? You have any books coming up, or can you speak on any of your projects?
That's a great question. So at Popsci, we are celebrating our 150th anniversary, which is a huge deal. Not many magazines live to that ripe old age. So there's a lot of fun stuff happening over at Popsci. And we also have, we actually just today, we published a bonus episode of The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week that was focused on old archival Popsci stuff. So that's pretty fun and wacky. We talk about the time that Popsci wrote about how there might be crabs on the moon or beavers on Mars. Yeah, other than that, I will say I am working on a proposal for a second book. I'm not quite ready to talk about it yet, but I'm hoping that that will be coming together over the next few months. And I'm also planning on trying to write some fiction in the next couple of years. So lots coming, hopefully.
So you be excited then. Yeah. Wow. I always want to know about the projects, but people are like, oh, we can't speak on them yet. And I'm like, oh. Well, I've really appreciated chatting with you tonight. And there are a couple questions about the recording. Oh, we have another question. Lee is wondering, are you planning any collaborations? You and Mary Roach, exclamation point.
Well, Mary was a guest on Weirdest Thing not too long ago. And I am a huge fan of her work. She is a big reason that I am the kind of science writer that I am. And anytime anyone compares us or even says our names in the same sentence, I am absolutely floored and a little embarrassed because I'm like, I hope she doesn't think that I think but no. So short answer, no collaborations planned with Mary Roach anytime soon, but I certainly hope to have her on our podcast again soon.
Yeah, not yet is what you should say. Not yet. And I did share the website link for Popsci so you guys can join. And I also shared Rachel's personal website where you can find more information about her. And for the questions about the recording, yes, this is being recorded. Everyone will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, the discount code, a link to tonight's title, and both the websites will be in there. So if you just watch tonight, it's okay. We've got you covered. And Rachel, next time, can we do this in person for your next book, please?
I would love to. I am super excited. All of my events are with indie bookstores, which makes me really excited. I've been telling everybody when they ask me where to buy the book, I'm like, buy it at your favorite independent bookstore. So last night we had our event at the Strand. Tomorrow I have a very small in-person event at my local in Jersey City. And then next week, I have one with Northshire. But yes, hopefully next time, but the next time I have a book coming out, I certainly hope to make it over to the West Coast for a couple of events, and I would love to do one at Copperfield.
Oh my goodness. Well, we'll wait for it. And really, the best wishes on your tour. It's going to be great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll see you soon. Have a nice evening.
You too.
Bye.